it's certainly true that we have seen certainly increased activity, particularly from the US, and I suspect the reason for that is the weak pound. But I think there are other reasons, and now that there are some fantastic businesses, particularly in this part of the UK. And the reason that they are fantastic businesses has nothing to do with Brexit. It's because they're well run, they're well managed, and they're well financed. And those types of things are always going to be attractive to investors, whether they are from the UK, from Europe, or the US. What business owners need to do is to continually review their processes and their practices to ensure that when it comes to either an investment or a sale, whether that be a trade sale or a sale to an investor, is to make sure that during the due diligence process there is nothing there that's going to spook a potential purchaser. And it's a really simple process, but essentially you as the business need to be looking at your business from an external point of view and thinking if there's anything in there that would cause a potential investor to either chip the price or to actually walk away from the deal.
To be honest, there really isn't. I mean, from an insolvency and restructuring point of view, it's all about the European insolvency regulation.
So they are of paramount importance.
Yeah, I mean, it's the key thing in terms of the processes that are going to operate within the sector, sort of post-Brexit, and the things that might be changed. That's it.
Well, it's an interesting question. People have been using admiralty courts, long before the EU, and indeed long before a lot of this legislation recognising, the law of nations, as it were, came into effect. In admiralty terms, curiously enough, one of the unusual aspects of marine law is that a vessel is a legal person in its own right. So it doesn't matter where that person is, that is where the issue is, and you simply arrest the vessel and you take your chances after that. It doesn't matter where the vessel is. You don't need to go to a domestic court to enforce. You simply arrest it and go from there. But the other thing, and I guess I can't speak for other industries, but the Admiralty Court, when I say the Admiralty Court, actually not a lot of disputes are dealt with in the Admiralty Court. Most disputes are dealt with in arbitration, and Lloyd's arbitration, LMAA. There's a whole series of international arbitration arrangements that are centred in London and all use English law. And I suspect that I'm not alone in saying most arguments between commercial bodies are dealt with in some form, seldom dealt with within the Supreme Court. They're dealt with within these arbitration, and they all recognise it and they all contractually subscribe to it. If it doesn't have the teeth at the end of the day, then it's certainly going to cause people to question whether they're going to use it in the future. Within Europe, internationally, I don't think that's so much an issue, because a lot of these courts have got long-standing international enforcement arrangements which run in parallel with the EU.
Property market has always gone up and down, and there's peaks and troughs throughout the year anyway. March seems to be a good time to put your house on the market because a lot of people are looking to buy at the start of the spring. Everything looks nice and your house starts looking quite shabby. So people always tend to. The property market is the first thing that you start having a little bit of quibble when people can't afford things. So when you haven't got cash in your pocket, you tighten your belt and you make do. So having something that you can do or improve on your house will be quite a good thing to have. And there have been schemes that the government tried to push out there, but they didn't really take off that well. Getting the 5,000, do you have to contribute towards that yourself?
Well, I think what you do is apparently the contractor who has a deal with the Inland Revenue, or the equivalent of the Inland Revenue in Sweden, and effectively you pay the net amount, and he claims back the balance.
Because there have been schemes here where to insulate your house, and the schemes or the people that are put forward were more expensive So people thought, well, actually, I'm going to go to Mr. Jones down the road and do it cheaper because you just get a discount.
No, this is anything.
Anything.
This is chopping down your trees. This is relaying the garden. It's a wide range, and of course it's a way of then creating or maintaining a good healthy industry of small local businesses providing building support as well.
I think conversely, one of people's concerns with uncertainty is that people stay put. And actually, if you're introducing an incentive which effectively encourages people to stay put and spend money on their own homes, then I'm wondering actually whether that wouldn't have a positive effect in terms of people buying and selling, which is probably what you want to have a fluid market.
Not particularly, because as I said previously, so much of our protection comes anyway from either purely domestic law or an overlap and an enhancement in some cases of European legislation. I do think, as I said, I do think that there are some areas that could be tidied up and that would really help businesses if those actually were addressed. That I think in terms of changes, potentially not a huge amount will be under attack, but you've got some areas of European legislation which are particularly unpopular. So, for example, the agency workers regulations. As an employer, if you have a short-term resourcing need, you can take on a temp worker, as we all know them. But unfortunately, for a lot of businesses under European legislation, after 12 weeks, those workers have the same rights as your permanent staff, which really isn't what was intended or in some cases necessarily wanted by either party. So as I say, I think there are a few tweaks that will come along because some of those regulations are hugely unpopular amongst business owners, and I think it's an easy win from a political point of view to address some of those. But I think the vast majority of the existing legislation and regulation otherwise will remain, partly because some of it just covers, as I said before, fundamental working rights these days, and partly because it's utterly enshrined in our working practice.
There's speculation, isn't there, that the European regulations will continue to operate in relation to Europeans working in the UK going forward. So you may have different regulatory frameworks depending on which country the employee actually emanates from.
Yeah. Well, if that's the case, then it will be more complicated. Yes, it will be.
I suppose significant is the simple answer. I read an article recently, which is a slightly different figure from the one that you mentioned, but I think it suggested that if the country doesn't retain access to the single market after Brexit, then we could lose more than 175,000 EU workers in the construction industry, which is 8% of the sector's workforce. So actually, we might not necessarily be talking about an issue about whether or not people can afford to buy things or want to buy things. There might actually be a problem with getting them built if we don't have the right skilled sectors to build them. So I do think that construction is going to have an important, or the impact of how Brexit unrolls on the construction industry is going to have an important effect on property. I suppose, in a sense, it links into employment, doesn't it? So in terms of what EU regulations look like post-Brexit.
It's an interesting question, actually, and I was talking to an immigration lawyer last week who made the point that there's an awful lot of misconception that applies in relation to immigration, and that the vast majority of workers that come here from the EU are exactly that, workers. And as you say, whichever stats we focus on, and I think to a certain degree some of those figures are prone to speculation, although we can of course quantify how many people we do have working here from the EU, but needless to say, it's a sizable figure either way, and a change will have a big impact. So yes, it's an interesting point.
I think it could come down to, at the end of the day, whether people feel welcome post-Brexit. If even if we are able to integrate European laws, etc., it's not just the worker that's here. Often they're here with their families, and they want to feel that they're part of something.
We talked to a number of startups, and I am always intrigued and amazed by the different ideas that they have, and the perceptions they have on business and how they can do things completely differently. You know, they look at a sector, they look at an industry, and instead of conforming, they will try something different. And unfortunately, the thing with startups is that some of them, or a fair amount of them, will fail in the first 12 months, not through the lack of ideas or the lack of effort or anything else really, but simply through the lack of cash. And in advising any startup, you know, I hate to be sort of dull about it, but instead of focusing necessarily on the ideas and the exciting bits, you've really got to focus on the boring bit, and that is to look at your cash flow projections, to look at what your overheads are and your expenditure, and to work out how you are going to pay the bills after 6 months, 9 months and 12 months. And it's about being, I think, reasonable in your profit projections to work out how in worst case scenarios you are actually going to be able to pay those bills. But I think there will be many opportunities that Brexit presents itself, because life is going to change, industry is going to change, business is going to change, and there's going to be all sorts of areas where people can look at what the status quo used to be and come up with new and innovative ideas of how to do things, and that will create opportunities for people. And I think the graduates who are coming out now are best placed to deal with those changes and to really exploit that uncertainty.